My paper is titled Duplicating for the Movement. I'm interested in how people create the stories that explain their lives. My chief concern is regarding technological access. How do people who are denied access to leading technologies find other tools fitted to their hands for magnifying their voices and strengthening their communities? My paper looks at mimeography as a dominant feature of constellations of reproduction. Mimeography has become the face for a highly creative process of adapting available skills and technologies for social ends. Considering constellations of reproduction will help us to better recognize the unheralded individuals who often produce social movement publications rather than just the person at the crank. While mimeography has pride of place, I point out a range of tools within constellations of reproduction for movement messages. Mimeography, typewriting, hand-drawn art, and other forms of mechanical reproduction have together reflected the diffusion of skills across industrial and office boundaries. All types of skills and levels of technological access were essential to how communities created internal and external communications. In this paper, I first focus on Ukrainian identity produced and reproduced by soldiers of the Waffen-SS Galicia division of the German Army after World War II in Italy. And then I turn to the Daughters of Bilitis, the women's homophile organization in the mid-20th century in the United States. In the decade after World War II, the Daughters of Bilitis became the first national organization espousing lesbian identity in the United States. Its publication, The Ladder, was a foundational mouthpiece for organizations and for contributing readers, not unlike the publications produced by Ukrainian soldiers in a prisoner of war camp in Rimini, Italy. Ukrainians sought to lay claim to an independent national identity and to create bridges to Anglo-American cultures sympathetic with anti-communist nationalism. The Daughters of Bilitis aimed to create public spaces in which their lives could be acknowledged as part of larger society. In a sense, both are discussions of relocation and appropriateness to the communities they sought to be part of. In the British post-war camps in which Ukrainian soldiers volunteering from Galicia were interned, writing, manufacturing, reading, and sharing camp publications provided a stable group identity in the midst of change. Mimeography offered an organizing principle for a constellation of duplication techniques that enabled a group of diverse individuals to close ranks and to cohere. The integration into the German military unit of Ukrainian personnel involved in suppressing Polish resistance and in committing war crimes against civilians has made studying these soldiers and their publications problematic. The publications were part of a carefully orchestrated narrative expressing the soldiers' potential for integration into non-communist societies and of independent nationhood denied, which helped to give them validity in the eyes of Anglophone countries. Unified nationalism has been a component in the masking of individual perpetrator identities, and I want to acknowledge that in my talk. Because of this complex and contested background, analyzing the print produced by the Waffen-SS Galician Division, or the 1st Division of the Ukrainian National Army, the UNA, touches on controversial ground. It also helps us to understand how individuals and a community form a narrative about their cultural identity for those inside that community, as well as promoted to those external to the community. The soldiers interned at Bellaria and moving to Rimini did just that from their arrival in May and June of 1945 to relocation in other countries in May of 1947. After marching quickly to Allied territory at the close of the war in order to surrender to British forces rather than to Soviet forces, between 9,000 and 9,500 soldiers were interned at the Italian camps. Estimated numbers range from 9,000 to about 10,000, but enthusiasts of Ukrainian nationalism tend to say even more than 10,000. Physicians, nurses, and clergy accompanied the troops, as well as some family members who had followed the troops to Italy. Women and families were housed in a separate camp soon after arrival. The fighting corps included peasants, laborers, and selected educated members. At Bellari and Rimini, the soldiers produced an array of cultural print to accompany the courses, choirs, and sporting clubs that they devised to increase education and solidarity. In addition to being targeted to soldiers, the content also aimed to generate a sense among British commanders overseeing the camp that an individual and a national independence were essential to Ukrainian identity. British commanders helped to set up a library in the camp, with publications being produced shortly afterwards. As daily, weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly publications, with occasional inserts for religious observances and other special events, these homemade prints provided humor in a difficult situation. They performed a number of functions, such as cementing relations between the well-educated and those with little or no education. For some soldiers, this was their way of learning how to read Ukrainian. Copies point to rudimentary support by British administrators for the men producing camp publications, but much of the material and the machinery seem to have been put together opportunistically within that 2-year period. OSA, or the WASP, took its name from previous Ukrainian uses of the WASP to title publications known for piquant commentary or to lend a pen name to a subversive literary author. The title went back decades in Ukrainian publishing, and it also was the name of an immigrant publication in the United States in the 1930s. At the camp, a prospectus and more than a score of weekly issues from 1945 to 1946 have survived in a collection created by Orest Horodisky, who assisted with the publication. He provided a number of samples of these publications to the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota, where I formerly worked. Press runs for OSA varied from a few dozen to about 300, with 200 being most typical. Usually these were 6 pages in the first year of publication, but it grew to 8 or even 10 pages with occasional supplemental issues. OSA is the only publication from the camps that continued after soldiers were resettled abroad. It was published in the UK later. In my research, I've been tracing the names of selected editors and illustrators. It's fairly well known that publishing and cultural leadership within displaced persons camps became the seedbed for publishing and for community organizing in the diaspora for displaced persons. I had somewhat expected the same pattern to exist among surrendered enemy personnel, but I found a somewhat different pattern, and that seems to be because most of the people in the camps weren't printers and they weren't writers. They were making things up as they went along. Also, there is the aspect that many people who were in the camps were fully recognizing that they would have to pass scrutiny in order to be able to move abroad. A certain number of people in the camps were part of committing war crimes, and that has been a factor in the desire by many people in the community to protect identities. Additionally, although I have some language capacity outside of English, my Ukrainian is not fluent by any means, and I am not a member of the community, and so therefore it has been a little bit difficult to gain the trust of people. But I have been able to work with certain community members. For that reason, the spellings reflect community spellings that were prominent in Ukrainian publications in the United States in the 1950s through the 1980s. In this slide, we can see clues about the production, also in the following slide. Volodymyr Kaplan and a number of artists provided illustrations generously for OSA. His initials, BK, pointer. Right here, big K. Let's see. Are registered in the prospectus. And Kaplan contributed to other camp publications, also using these same initials. Kaplan apparently immigrated to South America and continued his art career there. The art itself was mimeographed, this portion, on each of these publications, but the text generally was typed, and that seems to be fairly consistent of many of the publications, but not all of them in the camps. Here, we can see evidence of carbon imprint. The original is typed, and this is from a separate page that is later on. This is a 3-page prospectus, and this clearly tells us that the impression was made by the striking of an original paper, which then impressed upon the carbon and then created an image on a second sheet of paper. Therefore, it's hard to say exactly what is the original, and this was done in fairly small runs, but it is remarkable that they could do 120 of the actual publication when it was produced. This image I find quite interesting. Instead of whiteout, as Americans would say, this appears to be obliterine, which was a white fluid that allowed stencil repairs to be made. Instead of creating strength in the substrate, here we see obliterine to be something that actually creates a colorant. And the artist was able to establish a fairly sophisticated color palette, a grayscale, even though very few options for coloring were available. Obliterine would have been obtained from the British commanders at the camp by gift or by borrowing. Oris Torodisky was born in 1918, and he became radicalized in the tumultuous 1930s. He was convicted in 1939 for participating in Ukrainian nationalist activities in Galicia, and this encouraged him to turn to military action to further the dream of an independent Ukraine. He stated in a biography that he served 1944 to 1945 in the Galician Division. The timing is very crucial because the war crimes were committed in early 1944, and shortly thereafter, German authorities created a military unit because they wanted to make sure that the energies of the police, Ukrainians serving in German police forces, was modified into military action rather than violence that could be more easily disguised and perpetrated upon civilians. This does not, by saying this, I am not saying that all people who were Ukrainian committed these war crimes. I want to be highly specific. However, it's very difficult to find the specific individual perpetrators. Horodisky reported on cultural programs for a number of publications in the camps, and particularly was involved in a student publication, which he did not provide copies in the collection that he donated. The deft caricaturist Gogo, or Orest Slupczynski, provided very impish puck-like drawings for a number of the publications, but particularly for Osa, which was a satirical magazine. In the enlarged letter U, we can see a halo of ink. I'm not sure if you can see right there and right there. You can see the diffusion of the oil that was used to as a vehicle for the ink. From this, I'm going to speculate that instead of using a mimeograph ink or a Gestetner, or these are actually proprietary forms, and so I want you to know that I'm using mimeography very loosely. Instead of using proprietary ink for any of these systems, Probably they used printer's ink that had been thinned by spirits or by gasoline. That's a very common adaptation. Krinsky escaped the camp rather than following through with being cleared by British authorities, and he made his way to another country. Apparently, he came to the United States in 1951. He drew for a Ukrainian-American satirical publication during its heyday and became very well known among Ukrainian Americans through books and his work for cultural organization publications. Like Oris Torodisky, he earned his living as a draftsman and supported the Brotherhood of Veterans of the 1st Division of the Ukrainian National Army. Yunatsky's Reeve, or The Warrior's Aim, or Youth Surge, or Youth Uprising, as each of these have various translations that can be made, was published from September 1945 through 1946, and this had about 120 copies per issue. Yunatsky's Reeve began as a rough publication which mimeographed the masthead, but it had handwritten and typed text so that you could have updates that were relevant to the current happenings of the camp. The quality improved incrementally throughout its production, and the number of pages grew from 12 to 24. Articles in this publication especially featured basic cultural and vocational education for soldiers. For instance, Taras Shevchenko, a particularly prominent 19th century figure in Ukrainian literature and arts, graced the cover of one issue. A regular column about electrical technologies and science in other issues and across most issues prepared readers for success in a training course at the camp. These courses were intended to give people occupation so that they could more readily be resettled. Yunatsky's Reeve sought to tie together a theme of self-reliance and ways of learning skills appropriate for post-war relocation. We also see a recurring fleur-de-lis, which is reminiscent of Scouting. This publication was focused on youth audiences, and the independence and masculine nationalism were very consistent with how international Scouting evolved in many locations around the world. These images indicate that the printers worked with ink as they were able to procure it rather than having a ready supply. You can see on the lower image, blue. This is actually black, but it has a very blue tone. When you look under close magnification, you can readily see that this is black ink, but the blue tone says to me that quite possibly they were mixing inks. They also used the toning intentionally, so it really is kind of a type of blue-gray, but when it is part of something larger or put together so that there's more intensity, you can see that it turns completely black. In other issues here, this is from an October issue, we see that it looks thoroughly black, but this is a symptom of opportunistic publishing. Taborovik, or the camper, can be translated in several ways. You could translate it as camper, which sounds very voluntary and not very appropriate to a prisoner of war camp. Inmate might be a better translation. As with other titles, I've followed transliteration practices of the Ukrainian American community. Hand-colored mastheads make this publication very distinctive. The mimeography lies in the print. All of this is hand coloring. If you look under further magnification, you can see that it was brushed on. There are pools of pigmentation that juxtapose one another for each of the boundaries. You also see that they added occasional touches with a graphite pencil to bring out weakening lines. These show where pencil has touched it up and made the mimeography a bit stronger. And that's a good way to make a bad print sellable or a bad print readable. I also wanted to point out the use of ballpoint pen, which was quite unusual during this time period. You can tell that this is ballpoint pen because of the striations which follow what would have been the ball and the flow of ink being impeded by very small grit particles. Ballpoint pens would have been procured from RAF. The Royal Air Force was a supply, and ballpoint pens were quite unusual during post-World War II Europe. Therefore, we see yet more evidence that of the close relationship between the English commanders and some of the publishers, one way or another. Over the course of the publication, 4 distinct typewriters were used. 2 English typewriters, one was serif and one was sans serif, a Cyrillic typewriter, and also a Polish typewriter. The English typewriters were sometimes modified to be Ukrainian by creating a slash either with pen or a slash with the actual slash available on the keyboard, so that the L's could, for instance, be pronounced as ludge, like L for ludge. These modifications, including the tops of letters being pinned in, are adaptations, and they show that regardless of what type of technology that was available, they were very insistent on trying to find something that would Ukrainianize any of the technologies that they used. And the language acquisition was a very important part of their solidarity. At times, an editor represented that silent sound manually, but there were times when they tried to do it to much less success using keyboard notes. There is also a double dot which was added manually at various times in certain issues. Now, the use of so many typewriters is a bit curious because one editor edited the magazine or the journal the entire time. To me, this says, yet again, we're finding people putting together access to any type of machinery that they have, and it does make you, in some ways, admire their persistence and resilience, being able to find a typewriter by hook or by crook. As you would expect from typed materials, the text is only on one side, except for an example here that is drawn from a later issue. This example shows the original typewritten. It's actually the carbon copy, because I don't have the first typewritten portion, but this is a carbon copy. Someone had inserted another carbon copy incorrectly. They inserted it wrong ways, which created on the other side of that sheet a mirror image of the recto side of the sheet. And from this, we can see that they were using multiple carbon copies and not just creating 1 or 2, but probably several. You can do up to about 11 carbon copies and still be legible. After that, it becomes too difficult to fit within the platen. Now I'd like to turn to the second example, the daughters of Bilitis. Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin founded the Daughters of Bilitis in 1955 with the assistance of 3 lesbian couples who, like them, sought to make it easier for women to meet other like-minded women. Their group sought to balance safety with visibility, given the hostility that many faced in society. Ultimately, their work had a conservative tone because their goal at the outset was to make it easier for the variant, as they called themselves, or called homosexual women, to fit within larger society. Within short order, they settled on a tactic of conversations held publicly and a mimeograph newsletter to gather and make available factual information and public dialogue about homosexuality. Their in-person meetings enabled lesbians to network and to discuss homosexuality publicly, and for most of them, this was the very first time that this was a possibility. The meetings established connections among women and carved out the possibility of affirmation within a public space and of acceptance within larger society. Their newsletter, The Ladder, became the first national publication for lesbians. in the United States. The editor described the latter as an instrument for allowing readers to gain their perspectives from the variant's point of view, as I've mentioned. From its earliest days, the publication sought to educate readers and to increase the amount of readily available information about homosexuality. Initially, the aims emphasized the integration of homosexuals into society, but the publication later came to articulate lesbianism as a core identity on its own. The publication sought to bring to the fore a variety of topics related to perceptions about lesbians. At the same time, the editors realized that evidence from the lives of lesbians from the perspectives of the women themselves was a crucial missing piece in most discussions. By founding a publication that blended articles about the societal frameworks that excluded homosexuals from full participation in society, with the reader contributions reporting on personal experience, the group led the only initiative documenting the lived experience of lesbians in the United States. Organizers of the publication led the way, with the majority printing their full names in the staff box. This required a great deal of courage in the 1950s. The latter advanced a new knowledge base, enabling lesbians to contest existing beliefs and stereotypes. It also strategically positioned them as proponents of conversations on important issues in a democratic society. Sustained reporting on penal codes allowed the publication to outline methods for promoting change in legal processes. While phrased as dialogue, their work clearly advocated for removal of constraints against the rights of lesbians. 1 year into the publishing venture, the value of nationwide distribution became clear. Only 17 people actually paid for subscriptions when this publication began. However, the editors added names so that a total of 200 people, including the 17 subscribers and also those who were considered to be sympathetic professionals or other contacts of the women, so that you could have a much larger subscription base. By the second year, word had spread, and twice that many subscribers received the latter. The latter assisted in building audiences and creating confidence for the public meetings, which drew from between 8 to 45 people and promoted visibility on the ground and increased the network. Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin joined a panel in 2002 in which they talked about the role of mimeography being a key part of getting the publication off the ground. They initially used a press, a mimeograph machine that had been owned by the Mattachine Society, a men's organization that preceded Daughters of Bilitis by about 5 years. And popular lore about the latter has been that it was a mimeograph publication, but I want to dive just a little bit deeper. Although it began as a mimeograph publication, it was produced by a number of techniques and only towards the end moved back into mimeography. After the first 2 issues, and here we have a sample from the 3rd issue, mimeography was deemed inadequate to the quality desired for the publication. Organizers turned to sympathetic women who staffed the print shop at a local retail store so that they could gain better quality from a Multileaf press. After a period of time, the group took materials to a vendor rather than relying upon volunteers who had to hide the printing among other materials at a commercial establishment. None of these techniques was permanent. It was, again, opportunistic, working with what is most available and with the skills that you have at hand. You can see here slight dots underneath the braces of the T. You also see slight dots here in the H. Now, what we would expect if this were typewritten and mimeographed would be a much more consistent coverage of dots across the letters. However, these dots, which are just focused in certain areas, are produced by a photographic process. It is produced by a photolithographic process which takes an image, photographs it, and then in the production, the lightest dots are dropped out. So dots that are caused by impact of the key from the typewriter upon the original, which is then photographed, the lightest dots will drop out and only the heaviest dots will show. That's a photographic process rather than mimeography. So that is one way to be able to tell that this actually is a multilith process rather than mimeography. We also find lithography used very consistently for the front covers. It's of interest to me that we say everything was mimeographed and it's very text central or centrist, when the image that is on the cover is the first thing that you see. In fact, if you recall the earlier picture of the two founders of Daughters of Bilitis and the latter, they were holding up the cover, they weren't holding up the text. And so that, again, is one of the reasons I like to focus on constellations. While mimeography is a dominant technology, lithography is what we see first. In this image, this murky black coverage, which is drawn from this small area right here, is indicative of lithography. There's a washed out look when you see lithography. This would not work as a large coverage area of ink on mimeography. So we find that the artwork was a distinguishing feature. And eventually, the picture of two women and the ladder was changed to a variety of images which could be produced with line art and then printed through photolithography. And I'm going to presume that this is an offset lithographic process. Probably it was printed on an AB Dick because there are slight notices within referring to the AB Dick company that could have been true mimeography, but probably it's talking about this process right here. And so after looking at these two examples, we return to the beginning of the paper. Though Ukrainians and lesbians, and these are not mutually exclusive categories, but the examples were quite different, they're separated by culture and by language, by location, and by gender. Yet these paired examples show how mimeography and related technologies made self-publishing a reality under very difficult circumstances. Each of these groups sought to establish multivocal, yet coherent and stable narratives that legitimated their claims to a distinct identity and to the right to being in public and the right to recognition as a distinct community. Constellations of reproduction, with mimeography central to the network, but not exclusively the method of duplication, made it possible for social movements to pursue their community goals. These publications allow us to study material objects as discursive practices. They also suggest, to me, that diverse, inclusive communities offer a valuable range of skills and points of access to technologies, even when no single member is ideally skilled in a specific technology. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth Haven Hawley, for that really fascinating analysis and of Ukrainian prisoner of war publications and the publications from Daughters of Bilitis. I wanted to also extend a big thanks for all of your fantastic research, which we've found extremely inspiring, as well as for very kindly and generously coming to the conference here in London from the University of Florida. So a big thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, of course, it's a burden to come from Florida, but actually I like the weather here quite a lot.
So to open up for questions. It's a little bit loud. Okay. Is there any questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. That was, yeah, I have loads of questions, but I'm going to just hit you with two. So one was kind of what are the main issues you come up with working with these kinds of archives, and kind of how do you approach them and challenge them? And then secondly as well, I saw that lots are based in Minnesota, but I was wondering, have you ever, especially with the Ukrainian prisoner of war camps, have you ever managed to access any other archives? Sorry, I know that was a lot.
Yes, when first I'll talk a little bit about working with ethnic communities. I've frequently worked with ethnic communities. I'm a heritage professional who has worked in museums, in research archives, and now in a research library. And something consistent that I've been working on is to make sure that we can preserve the widest possible range of human experience, which means I don't care whether it's popular or not popular. If people did it, I want to have a copy of it. And it has at times been difficult to separate my own politics from what I seek to preserve. In working with communities, I often talk with people who don't wish to have an unseemly side of their history preserved. What I tell them is, if you don't allow us to preserve the complexity of the experience, people will think your life was easy. They'll think that your choices were not hard to make, and they won't understand the gray that we actually live with. I have worked at a Jewish museum, and I have worked with people who are strong Ukrainian nationalists, and I've worked with pro-gay and certainly anti-gay people, but we have to be able to say everyone has access to technology, and what does that mean to democracy? One thing I'm moving toward in this talk is suggesting that access to technology is not limited to the ones that we like. They're limited. If we're committed to democracy, we will have full access to as much technology as possible, but we also won't belittle technological access that's not at the leading edge, because people use what they can use and they use what's appropriate. We do find that there is a shaping of the type of technology and communication processes to the community and your possibilities. And another thing that I tend to study is what is the movement from early formation of a community or early formation of a certain cultural practice into the next phase. How do you continue past the founders? But I do find that people who are founders tend to want to have their story told. However, it's impossible to have someone else tell your story just like you can tell it. It would be inauthentic for them to tell your story exactly as you tell it. That's what the technology is for. What we want to do is to release the story so that other people can make meaning of it, because only in making meaning of it do people truly live beyond themselves. It has been a little challenging, but it has been also a great gift to be able to work with members of the Ukrainian American community. People who have been refugees never forget the trauma, and they have a great deal of anxiety about wanting to make sure that their experience has meaning. But figuring out how to give up the absolute control over that story is the only way for someone else to truly understand your path and your process. I hope that in a round way takes on your question.
Do we have any other questions for Elizabeth? Jim?
Elizabeth, you talk of the mimeograph as opposed to Multileaf distinction, and I think I think it's totally right to identify the way the letter structure on that later, the ladder thing, where you can see it was done by a Multileaf. But I don't actually think that it's those little dots you see and the fringing on the letter is to do with the way it was screened. I think they're from the fabric of the typewriter ribbon
Yes.
remaining on the original and then being reproduced.
Correct, and that was my intention. It was my intention to say that when the key strikes the ribbon, and I did not use the word ribbon, there is also pressure that is diffused out beyond the actual face of the key, and that is what transfers bits of basically dots that are from that fabric. So you're spot on, and I appreciate your clarification of my description.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
I thought you were implying it was screened using a, like the screen.
No,
Yeah.
in fact,
Okay.
that's one of the things
We're
that's
getting
so
techie here, by the
different
way,
is there was no screen. We're often talking about photolithography that has screens for images, but in none of those latter images did you see any type of screen. It was not a halftone process at all. And the regularity is something that, of course, tips off the halftone process.
Which is why they started using developed carbon ribbons. So that way you didn't get that little dot structure.
And that would be a wonderful thing. I would like to talk with you more about that, because documenting the exact processes that people were using, even though they overlap significantly chronologically, you can't say this happened and then that happened and then that happened. You can say this range was available during this time period and this range was available during this time period. Yes.
They overlap, yeah.
Thank you. It's a very unusual thing and a wonderful gift for me to be able to talk with people who are specialists, because I frankly don't have very many people to check my work, and I need more people like you to talk with.
10 out of 10 anyway.
I know, I say it anyway. So.
Any other questions for Elizabeth?
Hi. Could you just comment on how you think this idea of constellations of practice is affected by contemporary forms of technology like the internet, for example, or being able to make your own website, for example?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
How your idea of constellations of practice is affected by contemporary forms of technology, like being able to make your own website, for example.
I'm
Does that make
sorry,
sense?
I have a cold. I'm still having
No, am I?
What is the...
Your idea of contemporary forms of practice, constellations of practice.
Yes?
How do you think that's affected by contemporary forms of technology, like the ability to make your own website from scratch, and you can do everything yourself? You don't have to relate to others through practice.
One of the key things that we can do by studying the past is to recognize that there was more diversity in the past. It's much easier when you have something distant from yourself to look to see what the constellation is. In reality, desktop publishing and newer online forms of publishing have many constellations. You have to learn how to use a computer. You have to have online access. You have to have the capacity to have server storage space. You have to have the ability to migrate from one system to another. You have to be able to do coding. If you can't do coding, you have to use some type of expert system. When we talk with people who have done communication technologies in the past and learn from their experience, it helps us to start looking very critically and to, I call it chunkify, to figure out what bits are put together incrementally. Even unstated in that is the authorship and how something was typed in. We too often don't consider typewriting to be a skill. And that's where the concept of skill from the academic perspective is something that can be, that a boundary can be placed around and is defensible. It's not a skill if everyone can do it. But that's a very social perspective, and it privileges people of power to say something is skilled or unskilled. And I have found that when the technology moves beyond the most powerful group, suddenly it's considered to be unskilled because everyone can do it, and that's, I think, anti-democratic to look at that in that perspective. So when we look at constellations of electronic technology, there are people who are completely unseen and distant from time and space from us who are absolutely part of our constellation of practice for being able to do web design. I hope that helped answer somewhat.
Thank you. Do we have one last question? Okay, one question at the back there, Branko.
Yeah, I am quite familiar with your work because we've published your work in our book, but thanks for saying all this here today. It's really exciting. I got very excited actually when you said that probably the max of copies you can produce with a carbon paper is 11. Because I think that
yes.
part made it very, very visual for me and practical and beautiful. So I just wanted to say that, but also wanted to say something that has not come up in this talk. That is also your expertise in hectographs.
Yes.
So maybe if you want to say just a few words about that, because I think some people may not know what that is, and others may be interested in learning how vibrant that hectograph movement was in the US and all the publications that were produced that way.
Yes, and in the Ukrainian camp there was one publication, but I don't have an example of it. It was Life in Camps, Uturi Vitubor, I think it is, which was produced by Oros Tordisky through hectography. Hectography is a type of spirit duplicating as opposed to stencil duplicating. And one of the difficulties of working with hectography is that it almost always uses aniline inks, which are very fugitive, and so they don't last for very long. I know that as a common office technology, you can easily make 30 copies. You can make 50 copies. You can make really a bad 100 copies. It doesn't really make 100 copies. But the ability to melt down or to dissolve the gelatin and to reset it and to continue reusing it with a different image is something that makes hectography very useful for one-sheet publications. Many of these publications in the Ukrainian camp were initially one sheet. The norm was to put out single broadsides and to piece them together. The norm was not to have large sheets of paper because that was not what you could scavenge. You were only able to scavenge scraps of paper. And so that works quite well with a hectographic unit, which is going to be small and this size, so more like this. You would be able to borrow a hectographic unit and to print something fairly quickly if you were able to get it from someone who worked in an office. And then when you melt down the gelatin, no one knows exactly what you printed. There's a lovely fugitive aspect to the publication as well. Rather than tearing up something, it just simply goes away. But hectography also is a significant interest. I do want to say that the University of Iowa has a fantastic fanzine collection for science fiction fanzines that are hectographically printed in there in pristine condition. If you ever get to Iowa City, it's a wonderful place. And UC Riverside in California also has a very, very nice collection of hectography. But hectography in particular, in order for us to appreciate it, has had to have been kept by someone without its use. And this is one of the great challenges for heritage preservation. Sometimes the things that we have in heritage institutions are good for the future because they were lesser used. And so by being very selfish during the time frame and putting it away and not showing it to people, you could say maybe it's less relevant. On the other hand, maybe you could say that's what it takes to do right to the future generation. And we're always balancing whether to use or to not use. Is our need now to know more important than the need of future generations? And that's a very difficult decision sometimes to be making. And hectography raises this question a great deal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth.